The flak had stopped, the engines were dying, and 8 German fighters were circling like wolves around a wounded deer. Staff Sergeant Harold Whitaker sat alone in the tailgun position of his crippled B-17, watching those Focke-Wulf 190's edge closer through the thin air over Germany. His crew was screaming through the intercom, convinced they were about to die. But Whitaker had an idea, a crazy suicidal idea that no training manual would ever approve. He reached for the engine controls and did the one thing no sane airman would ever do in combat. He killed the remaining power. The bomber lurched into a death spiral, smoke trailing from 3 shredded engines, looking for all the world like it was going down. The German pilots saw easy prey and moved in for the kill. They had no idea what was waiting for them in those final 200 yards. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of March 14th, 1944, started like any other bombing mission over occupied Europe. Staff Sergeant Harold Whitaker woke at 0400 hours in a freezing Quonset hut at RAF Deenethorpe in England, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. At 22 years old, he was a veteran of 17 missions, which meant he was either very good or very lucky, probably both. The other men in his crew said Whitaker had ice water in his veins, that nothing rattled him, not the flak, not the fighters, not even the sight of fortresses exploding in midair like firecrackers. But that morning, as he pulled on his heated flight suit and gathered his gear, Whitaker felt something different in the pit of his stomach. His grandmother back in Ohio would have called it a premonition. His pilot, Captain James Riverside, just called it mission jitters. The target briefing was straightforward enough. The 8th Air Force was sending 350 bombers to hit ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. Intelligence said the Luftwaffe was running low on pilots and fuel. That resistance would be minimal. Whitaker had heard that line before and knew better than to believe it. The Germans always found a way to put fighters in the air, especially when American bombers were headed for critical industrial targets. He sat in the back of the briefing room, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife while the intelligence officer droned on about expected opposition and fighter escort ranges. When the officer mentioned that P-51 Mustangs would only be able to accompany them halfway to the target before turning back, Whitaker saw several of the newer crew members exchange nervous glances. That meant at least an hour over Germany with no friendly fighters, just bombers and whatever the Luftwaffe decided to throw at them. Their B-17, which Captain Riverside had christened Mississippi Maiden after his hometown sweetheart, was loaded with 5,000 pounds of incendiary bombs. Whitaker ran through his pre-flight checks on the twin 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the tail position, testing the traverse mechanisms and loading fresh ammunition belts. The tailgun position was arguably the most important defensive station on a flying fortress. German fighters loved to attack from the rear, where they could rake the length of the bomber with cannon fire, and it was Whitaker's job to make them pay for that approach. He had a confirmed kill count of 3 enemy fighters, which made him one of the more experienced gunners in the squadron. But experience in aerial combat was a double-edged thing. It kept you alive, but it also meant you knew exactly how many ways there were to die up there. The ground crew chief, a wiry sergeant named Kowalski from Pittsburgh, slapped the fuselage as Whitaker climbed aboard. "Bring her back in one piece, Whitaker," Kowalski shouted over the roar of engines starting up across the hard stand. "I got $20, says you're the only tail gunner who doesn't fire a single round today." Whitaker just gave him a thin smile and ducked into the bomber's belly. He knew Kowalski was going to lose that bet. He could feel it in his bones. The flight across the channel and into German airspace was routine, almost boring. 350 bombers stretched across the sky in a formation so massive it looked like a thundercloud. Whitaker sat in his cramped position, surrounded by aluminum skin and plexiglass, watching the English countryside give way to the French coast and then the patchwork fields of occupied Europe. The intercom crackled with routine chatter, position reports, and the occasional joke to break the tension. Their ball turret gunner, a kid from Texas named Bobby Alvarez, kept up a running commentary about everything he saw below. Farms and churches and the occasional German convoy scrambling for cover as the bomber stream passed overhead. Then they crossed into Germany proper, and everything changed. The flak started first, black puffs of smoke that bloomed around the formation like deadly flowers. The concussive waves rocked the bomber, and Whitaker felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with flying through an anti-aircraft barrage. This was the part where you couldn't do anything but sit and pray that the next shell didn't have your name on it. A fort 2 positions ahead took a direct hit, its right wing folding up like paper before the entire aircraft tumbled out of formation, trailing fire. Whitaker watched 9 parachutes deploy from the stricken bomber and said a silent prayer for the 10th man who didn't make it out. The flak intensified as they approached Schweinfurt. The Germans knew this target was critical and had packed the approaches with every anti-aircraft gun they could muster. Whitaker felt the bomber shudder as shrapnel punched through the thin aluminum skin, heard the ping and clang of metal on metal. Then came a sound he'd never heard before, a catastrophic bang that made the entire aircraft lurch violently to the left. The number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing, had taken a direct hit. Whitaker watched black smoke pour from the cowling as the propeller windmilled uselessly. Captain Riverside's voice came through the intercom, tight with stress but still controlled. "We've lost number 3, feathering the prop, bombardier, how long to target?" The reply came back, 7 minutes. 7 minutes suddenly seemed like an eternity. A B-17 could fly on 3 engines, but it would struggle to maintain formation and altitude. And a bomber out of formation was a bomber in trouble. They somehow made it to the target and dropped their bombs, adding their payload to the inferno, already consuming the ball-bearing factories below. But as they turned for home, the flak found them again. This time, it was worse. Number 4, engine, the outboard engine on the right wing, took shrapnel that shredded the oil cooler. Within 30 seconds, the engine was overheating, smoke pouring from every seam. Riverside had no choice but to shut it down before it caught fire. Now they were flying on just 2 engines, both on the left wing, and Mississippi Maiden was falling behind the formation, like a wounded animal dropping away from the herd. That's when the fighters showed up. Whitaker saw them first, 8 dark shapes high and to the right, circling like buzzards. He keyed his intercom. "Fighters, 4 o'clock high. Looks like 190s. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a brutish, powerful fighter that German pilots loved for its heavy armament and rugged construction. 8 of them against a crippled bomber with no friendly fighters in sight. The odds were not good. The German pilots seemed to be in no hurry. They knew the B-17 couldn't run, couldn't climb, couldn't do much of anything except try to fight. They spread out into a loose formation and began their approach. Not in a wild rush, but with the methodical precision of professionals who had done this many times before. Whitaker swung his guns to track the nearest fighter, waiting for it to come into range. His hands were steady on the grips, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The key to aerial gunnery was patience, waiting until the enemy was close enough that you couldn't miss, then giving them a burst that would tear them apart. The first attack came from the right rear quarter. 2 190s dove in together, their wings sparkling with cannon fire. Whitaker engaged the lead fighter, walking his tracers up toward the cockpit. The German pilot jinked hard left to evade, but his wingman flew right into Whitaker's stream of fire. The 50 caliber rounds chewed into the fighter's engine, cowling, and Whitaker saw pieces of metal spinning away. The 190 peeled off trailing white smoke, probably coolant, and dove away out of control. 1 down, 7 to go. But the victory was short-lived. As Whitaker tracked the damaged fighter, another 190 came in from a different angle and raked Mississippi Maiden from nose to tail with 20mm cannon shells. The impacts sounded like someone taking a sledgehammer to a garbage can. Whitaker felt the bomber shudder with each hit and heard Riverside cursing over the intercom. "We just lost number 2, the pilot shouted. "Number 1's running rough. I don't know how much longer we can stay airborne." Whitaker's mind raced through the tactical situation. 3 engines down, 1 running poorly, 8 miles of altitude to lose before they could even think about belly landing. And 7 very angry German fighters circling for another pass. The rest of the bomber crew was shouting over the intercom, panicked voices talking over each other. The navigator wanted to bail out. The co-pilot was trying to find a heading to neutral Switzerland. The radio operator was calling desperately for help that Whitaker knew wouldn't arrive in time. That's when the idea hit him. It was insane, completely contrary to every survival instinct and every page of training he'd ever received. But trapped in that tailgun position with death circling overhead, Whitaker realized their only chance was to do something so unexpected, so completely crazy, that the Germans wouldn't see it coming. He keyed his intercom, cutting through the panicked chatter. "Captain, I need you to shut down number 1 engine." The intercom went dead silent. Then Riverside's voice came back. "Say again, Whitaker? I don't think I heard you right." Whitaker took a deep breath. "Sir, we need to fake a crash. Kill the last engine, put us into a dive, make it look like we're going down. The fighters will get cocky, move in close to watch us go. That's when I'll nail them." There was a long pause during which Whitaker could imagine the debate going on in the cockpit. What he was suggesting was absolutely mad. Deliberately killing the only working engine on a damaged bomber 30,000 feet over enemy territory. If it didn't work, if the Germans didn't fall for it, or if Riverside couldn't restart the engine afterward, they would die. All of them. But the alternative was getting picked apart piece by piece while trying to limp home on one failing engine. Finally, Riverside's voice came back. "Whitaker, if this doesn't work, I'm going to kill you myself." There was a pause then. "All crew, this is the pilot. We're going to play dead. Hold on to something." Whitaker heard the change in engine noise immediately. The steady roar of the last working engine died away, and suddenly the only sound was the whistle of wind through the bullet holes in the fuselage. Mississippi Maiden's nose dropped, and the bomber began a slow, spiraling descent that must have looked completely authentic from outside. Through his gun sight, Whitaker watched the German fighters react. They stopped their circling and moved closer, clearly excited by the sight of the dying bomber. He could imagine what they were thinking, that they'd just scored another kill, that they could move in and verify the destruction before heading back to base to celebrate. Human nature was the same whether you were American or German. Everyone wanted to see their victory up close, wanted that moment of satisfaction before moving on to the next target. The fighters closed in, 4 from the left, 3 from the right, and 1 trailing slightly behind. They were less than 400 yards away now, well within range but still approaching. Whitaker's hands were slick with sweat inside his heated gloves. Everything depended on timing. Too soon, and they'd scatter before he could do real damage. Too late, and they'd realize it was a trap and blow Mississippi Maiden out of the sky. 300 yards. The lead German pilot was close enough that Whitaker could see the details of his aircraft, the personal markings on the fuselage, the yellow paint on the engine cowling that indicated a veteran pilot. 250 yards. The other fighters were bunching up, all of them angling to get a good look at the falling bomber. 200 yards. "Now, Captain!" Whitaker screamed into the intercom. He heard Riverside hit the starter on the number 1 engine. For a horrible second, nothing happened, and Whitaker thought the engine was too cold, that it wouldn't catch. Then the propeller jerked, coughed, and roared back to life. Riverside horsed back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he had, and Mississippi Maiden's death spiral suddenly reversed into a violent climb. The German fighters, which had been diving to follow the bomber down, suddenly found themselves almost colliding with their target as it surged back up. For a split second, they were perfectly positioned, close range, no evasive maneuvers, caught completely flat-footed. Whitaker didn't waste the opportunity. His thumbs mashed down on the firing buttons, and both .50 caliber guns roared to life. The guns bucked against their mounts as Whitaker poured fire into the nearest fighter. At less than 200 yards, the half-inch bullets hit with devastating effect. The 190's canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass, and Whitaker saw the pilot slump forward. The fighter snap rolled to the left and began tumbling toward the earth, 2 down. Whitaker swung his guns right and caught another fighter that was trying to dive away. He fired a 3-second burst that walked up the fighter's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The 190 shuddered, trailing fuel from ruptured tanks, and fell away in a flat spin, 3 down. The other Germans were scattering now, trying to get clear of the unexpected threat, but they'd gotten too close and were tangled up with each other. Whitaker caught a 4th fighter in a climbing turn, leading it perfectly, and watched his rounds punch through the thin aluminum of its wing. The wing folded, and the fighter cartwheeled through the sky. 4 down in less than 40 seconds. The remaining 4 fighters were trying to reorganize, but Whitaker had thrown their entire attack into chaos. One pilot, either braver or more foolish than his comrades, attempted a head-on pass at the bomber. It was a mistake. Whitaker's guns could traverse nearly 180 degrees, and he tracked the fighter through its entire approach. He fired a long burst that caught the 190 dead center. The fighter's engine exploded in a gout of flame, and the aircraft disintegrated in midair, 5 down. The last 3 fighters had finally gotten clear and were climbing for altitude, trying to reset their attack, but Riverside wasn't giving them the chance. With only one engine providing any real power, he was slowly coaxing Mississippi Maiden into a shallow dive heading west, trading altitude for speed. The bomber was shaking like a paint mixer, every rivet and seam screaming with stress, but it was moving away from the fighters. 2 of the German pilots decided they'd had enough and broke off, apparently unwilling to risk themselves against a bomber that had already killed 5 of their squadron mates. But the lead pilot, the one with the yellow cowling, was not ready to quit. He came in alone, diving from high and behind, determined to finish what they'd started. Whitaker watched him come, noting the pilot's technique. This wasn't a rookie. This was someone who knew what he was doing. Whitaker held his fire, letting the German commit to his attack run. The 190 grew larger in his gun sight, the yellow cowling bright against the gray sky. Tracers arced out from the fighters' guns, and Whitaker heard rounds punching through the bomber's tail section. A piece of plexiglass next to his head starred from a near miss. Still he held his fire, waiting. The German pilot must have thought he'd killed the tail gunner because he held his dive, closing to point-blank range to make absolutely sure of his kill. It was his last mistake. At 100 yards, Whitaker opened fire with both guns. At that range, he couldn't miss. His rounds tore into the fighter like a buzzsaw, shredding the engine, the cockpit, the wings. The 190 flew apart in a cloud of debris, tumbling pieces of aircraft that flashed past the B-17's tail, so close Whitaker could have reached out and touched them. 6 down. But the Germans' guns had been firing when his fighter died, and those last rounds had found their mark. Whitaker felt a hammer blow to his left shoulder and looked down to see blood spreading across his flight suit. The pain hit a second later, white-hot and overwhelming. He slumped against his guns, fighting to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain, he saw the last 2 German fighters turn away and disappear into the clouds. They'd had enough. 7 fighters destroyed or damaged out of 8. Not bad for 3 minutes of work. Riverside's voice crackled through the intercom. "Whitaker, report." "Whitaker, are you hit?" Whitaker tried to answer, but his mouth wouldn't work. The shock was setting in, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. He heard other voices on the intercom, people shouting his name, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. His last coherent thought before passing out was that at least they had a chance now. At least he'd bought them that. He woke up to the waist gunner, a stocky kid from Minnesota named Peterson, shaking him and yelling in his face. "Come on, Whitaker, stay with me. We're almost home." Whitaker blinked and tried to focus. His shoulder felt like someone was holding a blowtorch to it, but the bleeding had been slowed by Peterson's makeshift bandage. "How long?" Whitaker croaked. Peterson grinned. 20 minutes. Captain says we're crossing the channel now." The rest of the flight was a blur of pain and semi-consciousness. Whitaker drifted in and out, sometimes aware of the bomber's struggles to stay airborne on one engine, sometimes lost in feverish dreams. He dreamed of his grandmother's farm in Ohio, of summer days fishing in the creek, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. When Mississippi Maiden finally touched down at RAF Deenathorpe, the landing gear collapsed from flak damage, and the bomber slid down the runway in a shower of sparks and screeching metal, but it was down. It was home, and everyone was alive. The ambulance crew pulled Whitaker from the tail section and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they carried him past the bomber, he got his first good look at Mississippi Maiden in daylight. The aircraft looked like it had been used for target practice. There were hundreds of holes in the fuselage, entire sections of skin peeled back, and all 4 engines were damaged beyond repair. Ground crew personnel were walking around shaking their heads, amazed the bomber had made it home at all. Captain Riverside appeared beside the stretcher as they loaded it into the ambulance, his face haggard with exhaustion, but split by a huge grin. "Whitaker, you crazy son of a gun. Intelligence just confirmed 6 kills, maybe 7. That's got to be some kind of record for a tail gunner." Whitaker tried to smile back, but the morphine was kicking in and everything was getting fuzzy. "Did we get the target, sir?" he asked. Riverside nodded. "We did, and we got home, thanks to you." The weeks that followed were a haze of surgery and recovery. The German cannon shell had gone clean through Whitaker's shoulder, missing all the major arteries but leaving a wound that would take months to fully heal. He spent his days in the base hospital, sleeping and reading, and trying not to think too hard about those 3 minutes over Germany. The other patients, bomber crew members recovering from their own wounds, treated him like a celebrity. Word had spread about what he'd done, about the dead engine trick that had saved Mississippi Maiden and killed 6 German fighters in less than 3 minutes. The official recognition came in April. Whitaker was presented with the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony attended by half the personnel on the base. The citation praised his courage, his tactical innovation, and his remarkable gunnery skills. What it didn't mention was the nightmares he'd started having, dreams where he was back in that tail gun position, watching fighters close in. Only this time, the guns wouldn't fire, and the engine wouldn't restart. Those dreams would stay with him long after the physical wound healed. By May, he was cleared for light duty, though his shoulder would never have the same range of motion again. The flight surgeon told him his combat flying days were over, that he'd done his part and should be proud. They offered him an instructor position, teaching the next generation of tail gunners at a training base in Texas. It was a safe job, an honorable way to finish out the war. Whitaker almost took it. But then he went out to the hard stand one morning and saw Mississippi Maiden. The ground crews had spent 6 weeks putting her back together, replacing every damaged system, every shredded panel. She'd been renamed Whitaker's Revenge by popular demand. The new name painted on her nose, along with 7 small swastikas representing the confirmed kills. Captain Riverside was there, overseeing the final preparations for the bomber's return to combat operations. He saw Whitaker approaching and walked over. "She flies like a dream," Riverside said, patting the bomber's fuselage. "Better than before, if you can believe it. We're taking her up on a milk run to France next week, just to shake her down." He paused, then looked directly at Whitaker. "Could use a tail gunner, if you know anyone qualified." Whitaker looked at the bomber, at the tail section where he'd fought for his life, at the guns that had saved his crew. His shoulder ached just from the memory. The smart thing would be to walk away, take the instructor job, survive the war in safety and comfort. "I'll need to practice," Whitaker said finally. "Make sure the shoulder can handle the recoil." Riverside's grin could have lit up the entire airfield. "Practice all you want, Sergeant. You've got a week." The milk run to France went off without incident, as did the next dozen missions. Whitaker requalified on the guns, working through the pain until his shoulder adapted to the demands of combat. The crew settled back into their rhythm, flying deep into Germany to hit refineries and marshalling yards and factories. They saw fighters occasionally, but nothing like that day over Schweinfurt. Word had apparently spread among the Luftwaffe about the B-17 that played dead, and the tail gunner who'd turned it into a killing ground. German pilots gave Whitaker's Revenge a wide berth when they could. Whitaker completed his required 25 missions by July of 1944 and was offered a chance to go home. Again, he turned it down. He extended his tour to 30 missions, then 35. Other crews came and went, shot down or finished their tours and rotated stateside. Whitaker stayed, becoming a fixture on the base, the tail gunner everyone had heard about, but few had actually met. He didn't talk much about what he'd done that day in March. When pressed, he'd shrug and say he'd gotten lucky, been in the right place at the right time. But the crews who flew with him knew better. They saw the way he handled the guns, the calm precision with which he engaged enemy fighters. They saw how he'd position himself in the tail, eyes constantly scanning the sky, ready for anything. They saw a man who'd looked death in the face and not only survived, but turned the tables completely. The dead engine trick became part of bomber lore, a tactic that some crews attempted in desperate situations, though never with quite the same results. In September 1944, Whitaker's Revenge was finally shot down over Berlin, not by fighters, but by a direct flak hit that tore off the entire tail section. Whitaker found himself suddenly free falling through space, still strapped to his guns, watching the rest of the bomber tumble away trailing fire. He pulled his ripcord and felt the parachute snap open with a jerk that re-injured his shoulder. He landed in a field outside the city and was captured within an hour by German soldiers. He spent the last 8 months of the war in Stalag Luft III, a POW camp for captured Allied airmen. It was hard time, cold and hungry and monotonous, but he survived. The German guards knew who he was, Several of them mentioned the engagement over Schweinfurt, saying their Luftwaffe pilots still talked about the American tail gunner who'd lured in and destroyed an entire swarm. There was a grudging respect in their voices when they spoke of it, the acknowledgement of one warrior for another. When the Americans liberated the camp in April 1945, Whitaker weighed 40 pounds less than he had when he was shot down. He was flown to a field hospital in France, then shipped back to England, and finally put on a transport home to the States. The war in Europe ended a week after he arrived in New York. Japan surrendered in August. Harold Whitaker's war was finally over. He went home to Ohio, to his grandmother's farm, and a civilian life he'd almost forgotten existed. The Air Force had awarded him a second Distinguished Service Cross for his actions over Berlin, though he'd never felt he'd earned that one. He'd just been doing his job, trying to stay alive and keep his crew safe. The medals went into a drawer, and he tried not to think about the war. But the war wasn't done with him. Former crew members would look him up when they passed through Ohio, wanting to reminisce about Mississippi Maiden and those desperate days over Germany. Aviation magazines wrote articles about the dead engine trick, often embellishing the details until they barely resembled what had actually happened. Whitaker never corrected them. Let people have their stories. The truth was complicated enough. In 1948, he married a school teacher named Dorothy from the next town over, a woman who'd never asked him about the war and didn't seem to care about the medals in the drawer. They had 3 children and lived a quiet life that suited Whitaker just fine. He worked as a mechanic at a local airport, keeping his hands busy with engines and helping the occasional pilot with a bulky carburetor. Sometimes, when a B-17 flew over, part of the commemorative air shows that were becoming popular, he'd stop and watch it pass. But he never went up in one again. The nightmares faded over the years, though they never completely disappeared. There would be nights when he'd wake up in a cold sweat, back in that tail gun position, watching fighters close in. Dorothy learned to wake him gently, to talk him back to the present. She never asked for details, just held him until the shaking stopped. It was enough. In 1975, on the anniversary of the Schweinfurt raid, Whitaker received a letter from Germany. It was from the son of one of the Luftwaffe pilots he'd shot down that day, a man named Klaus Hartmann, who'd survived the war and become a commercial airline pilot. The letter was carefully worded, explaining that Hartmann's father had always spoken with respect about the American tail gunner, that he'd considered their brief engagement to be an example of skill and courage on both sides. The son wondered if Whitaker might be willing to correspond, to perhaps meet someday. Whitaker thought about it for a long time before responding. What would he say to the son of a man he'd killed 30 years ago? What common ground could they possibly find? But eventually he wrote back, a short letter describing that day from his perspective, acknowledging the courage of the German pilots who'd pressed their attack, despite taking heavy losses. A correspondence developed, tentative at first, then more open. They discovered they had more in common than either expected. 2 men who'd been shaped by war and spent decades trying to find peace afterward. They finally met in 1980 at an air show in France where both a restored B-17 and a Focke-Wulf 190 were on display. Klaus Hartmann was in his 50s by then, a distinguished-looking man with his father's military bearing. They shook hands awkwardly at first. 2 old warriors meeting across the gulf of years and history. Then Hartmann did something unexpected. He saluted, a crisp military salute that spoke of respect and recognition. Whitaker, after a moment's hesitation, returned it. They spent the day walking around the air show, looking at the aircraft that had defined their lives. Hartmann asked about the dead engine trick, and Whitaker explained how the idea had come to him in those desperate seconds over Germany. "My father always said you were the best gunner he ever faced," Hartmann said quietly. "He said you thought like a fighter pilot, always 2 steps ahead." Whitaker didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. Before they parted, Hartmann gave him something that had belonged to his father, a pilot's logbook with the entry for March 14, 1944. The entry was brief, noting the loss of 6 aircraft and the narrow escape of the remaining 2. At the bottom, Hartmann's father had written a single line in German that his son translated, "Today I met death, and it wore an American uniform. I am fortunate to be alive to write this." Whitaker carried that logbook home and placed it in the drawer with his medals. It was a reminder that the men he'd fought against that day weren't monsters or faceless enemies. They were pilots doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive, just like him. War had thrown them together in 3 minutes of violence that had changed all their lives. But it didn't have to define who they were forever. Harold Whitaker died in 2003 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by surviving members of his bomber crew, now old men themselves, and by Klaus Hartmann, who'd flown from Germany to pay his respects. They told stories about Whitaker, about his courage and his skill, and the impossible thing he'd done over Schweinfurt. They talked about how the dead engine trick had saved 11 lives that day and became part of the tactical manual for bomber crews. But what they remembered most was the man himself. Quiet, humble, never seeking glory or recognition for what he'd done. A farm boy from Ohio who'd found himself in extraordinary circumstances and risen to meet them. A warrior who'd learned to make peace with his past and find connection with his former enemies. A reminder that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, individual acts of courage and skill could make a difference. The dead engine trick was never officially adopted by the Air Force. It was too risky, too dependent on perfect timing and nerves of steel. But the story lived on in military aviation lore, passed down through generations of airmen as an example of tactical innovation under pressure. Flight instructors still teach it at the Air Force Academy, not as something to try, but as a case study in creative problem solving when all conventional options have failed. Whitaker's medals are now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, along with pieces of Mississippi Maiden that were recovered from the field outside Berlin, where she fell. School groups pass by the exhibit, looking at the Distinguished Service Crosses and the gun camera footage that captured 2 of those 6 kills. The plaque tells the story of the tail gunner, who played dead and turned the tables on 8 German fighters in 3 minutes. But what the plaque doesn't convey is the weight of those 3 minutes, the crushing pressure of that decision to cut power over enemy territory, the ice-cold calculation that led Whitaker to risk everything on a desperate gamble, the muscle memory and training that let him engage 8 targets in rapid succession with deadly accuracy, the aftermath of pain and nightmares, and the long road to peace. Harold Whitaker's story is one of thousands from World War II, a single thread in the vast tapestry of that conflict. But it endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature under extreme stress. When backed into a corner with no good options, some people freeze, some panic, some give up. And a very few find a third way, a solution so unexpected that it changes the entire equation. That morning in March 1944, with his bomber dying and enemy fighters closing in, Harold Whitaker chose not to accept the inevitable. He looked at the tactical situation with clear eyes, saw an opportunity where others saw only death, and executed a plan that required absolute precision and unshakable nerve. In those 3 minutes, he saved his crew, destroyed 6 enemy fighters, and created a legend that would outlive him by decades. The dead engine trick worked exactly once, that day over Schweinfurt. Whitaker never had to use it again, and no one else ever pulled it off quite the way he did. It was a unique moment in the history of aerial combat. 3 minutes when everything aligned perfectly, and one man's desperate inspiration changed the outcome of a battle. That's what made it legendary. Not just that it worked, but that it could have so easily failed, that the difference between survival and destruction was measured in seconds and yards, and the steady nerves of a 22-year-old tail gunner from Ohio. In the end, that's Harold Whitaker's legacy. Not the medals or the kill count, or even the innovative tactic. His legacy is the reminder that in the worst moments, when all seems lost, human ingenuity and courage can still turn the tide. That one person, in the right place at the right time, with the right skills, can make the impossible possible. That death is never truly inevitable until you accept that it is. And somewhere over Germany, in the cold skies of March 1944, 8 German fighter pilots learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they were moving in for an easy kill, thought they had the measure of the crippled bomber. They were wrong, and in the 3 minutes it took them to realize their mistake, Harold Whitaker wrote his name in the history books and brought his crew home alive. That's the story of the dead engine trick. That's the story of one tail gunner's finest 3 minutes. That's the story of how courage, skill, and desperate innovation combine to achieve the impossible. And it's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just for what happened, but for what it says about the human capacity to fight back against impossible odds and win.